Hi, all, and welcome to today's session. This one's a little different for us if you've tuned into any of our other webinars. So today we have an Ask Us Anything. We actually have been taking questions for the last few weeks. So we've got a lot of questions already identified that I'll be answering today. But I would like to point you to the questions feature. So you can ask questions throughout the session. I will do my best to answer them as we go or at the end, depending on the nature of the question and what topic it relates to. So just to start, a quick introduction. I'm Nicole Sullivan. I am the Director of Climate Services for CarbonBetter. So at CarbonBetter, we help folks with every step of their sustainability journey, from quantifying and disclosing their environmental impacts through storytelling and sustainability reporting, all the way to developing sustainability and decarbonization strategies, and ultimately reducing emissions through direct decarbonization as well as participation in the voluntary carbon market. I'm an environmental engineer by trade, and I've been in the consulting space for a long while. So I feel equipped to answer a lot of your hard questions. But if there's anything that comes up that I need to dig into later and get back to you, I will. All right. So to start, we had a few different questions come in about sustainability strategy. So the first one we had is, as a small business just beginning our sustainability journey, which cost-effective strategies should we consider for integrating sustainability into our operations to make an immediate positive impact? So my answer is going to be kind of an it depends situation, but I think for starters, it's awesome that you're wanting to get started and you're wanting to take action. One of the first things you can do is really identify the resources you have on your team that know about sustainability or that are passionate about it. Who are your stakeholders within your business that care about driving initiatives forward? And then while I know we have this burning desire to just like take action and throw money at solutions, it can be really important to actually set a strategy and have a plan. So in this space, there's this concept of what gets measured gets managed. And so it's really important to really first take a look at where you're at today to see what actions to prioritize. So if you haven't done so already, you can quantify your carbon footprint, look at your water impacts and waste impacts, and figure out where in your business you could drive the most change. And it's going to look a little different depending on the nature of your operation. So low hanging fruit actions, if you are like a manufacturer of a product, are going to look a lot different than the low hanging fruit you might incur if you are an office building. So I'm going to use the office example whereby you have office space that you maybe lease out. And so you quantify your carbon impacts and you realize that electricity consumption is really the biggest source of your emissions. So um, if you're leasing the space, maybe you don't have the option for on-site solar or that's out of your budget, but there's opportunities to look into, do you have access to potentially procuring a green energy plan? Or can you purchase renewable energy certificates? Or knowing what your carbon footprint is, can you purchase carbon offsets to start taking action while you plan for projects that might be bigger or longer term or require more investment, like investing in energy efficiency projects or lighting projects. One thing I forgot to, I guess, call to your attention in kicking this off, some of the slides today have QR codes with the option to dig deeper. So we've tried to really link up relevant content that we have for specific questions in case you want to dig further on a given topic. So I just wanted to call that to your attention as well. The next question we have is, how can we use the results of a materiality assessment to inform our sustainability strategy and drive meaningful change within our organization? And I'm actually going to take a step back on this one and really talk about, well, what is a materiality assessment? And this is something that we see is, it's a tool used very commonly in the ESG space or the environmental, social, and governance space. I'm going to really look at it in the lens of just the E or the environmental portion. And before you even do a materiality assessment, you should really look at how your business interacts with the environment, which is the concept of your environmental aspects. And at each place that your business interacts with the environment, there's the potential for environmental impacts. So let's look, for example, if you're in the agricultural space and you're using water to water your plants. That water withdrawal is an environmental aspect, and potential impacts could be depletion of water supply as well as degradation of water quality. So once you've gone through your business holistically and you've looked at your environmental aspects, so those points where you're interacting with the environment, as well as those potential environmental impacts, to dig into materiality, you're going to look at how important are each of those topics to your stakeholders. And stakeholders can mean any number of things depending on your business. Your stakeholders might be they might be your investors, they might be your customers, they might be your employees. So you've got to look at who this stakeholder ecosystem is that matters to you in the case of this materiality assessment, and then look at which of these topics are most important to them. You're also going to look at which of these topics pose like a risk to the success of your business. So while assessments can be somewhat subjective, you're going to basically define a scoring system and really figure out which of these environmental impacts topics are most important to your stakeholders or are most threatening to the success of your business. And then from there, once you've done that assessment, you can actually drill in and really focus on mitigating those risks. So, if water, say, is of high importance, maybe you're in the alcoholic beverage space, which, you know, alcoholic beverages consume a lot of water in the production, and so maybe water consumption is a really highly material topic. You can really start to, if you haven't done anything today, you might want to do a water footprint, and then you might want to set goals around reducing your water consumption and really taking action there. So materiality assessments are really a lever that can help you know where to focus your efforts as well as focus your resources, right? Because quantifying your impacts and taking action on your impacts and setting goals and implementing projects, all of that takes time and resources. So you want to focus your resources in a way that best protects the environment while also best protecting your business, both from a reputational and a success perspective, and then also that um, that benefits your stakeholders. Let's see. So the next question, and I was actually really excited that we got this one because this is a topic that I'm really passionate about, is how can we develop a holistic sustainability strategy that not only focuses on decarbonization, but also addresses other critical aspects like water and waste management. Um, and right now we see a lot of companies and brands setting net zero targets and really focusing energy on decarbonization, which is super important. I am a huge advocate for that. But when we look at net zero, we're really looking at carbon kind of in a vacuum, right? So the net zero equation looks at your carbon emissions and your efforts to reduce those emissions and offset those emissions with the goal of netting out to zero. But it leaves out a bunch of things. So other air pollutants besides greenhouse gases and carbon are excluded from net zero. So things like hazardous air pollutants or criteria air pollutants, those are excluded from a net zero approach. You're also not looking at water. And when we look at water, we're looking at both quantity and quality, right? So we should be considering our water withdrawals and our discharges and our consumption, as well as any degradation. So, is our business having a negative impact on water quality? And then from a waste perspective, there's a lot of considerations. You want to look at your waste footprint in terms of solid waste streams, hazardous waste streams, potentially electronic waste streams, and waste has a lot of considerations in terms of where is your waste going? So this poses a lot of complexities if you're in the consumer packaged goods space and you're selecting packaging. We're seeing like compostable packaging, for example, trending, and most individuals don't have access to industrial grade composting facilities, such that, like, is your compostable packaging actually ultimately even being composted? So I think in terms of setting a holistic strategy, it is really important to not look at carbon in a vacuum, but how you look at the different components of environmental impacts, will somewhat depend on the nature of your operations, the nature of your waste streams, whether water is a really heavy hitter for you. And I think something that is really important to keep in mind too is that water and climate are so closely interrelated, right? So, access to water, water scarcity challenges, they really go hand in hand. So it's important to consider them, and you can even consider them in your decarbonization strategies. So, we'll touch more on the voluntary carbon market later in the session, but you can actually look for carbon projects when offsetting your carbon emissions that also have co-benefits with specific focus areas. So if water is a big concern for your business or a high impact area, you might look for carbon credits that have water co-benefits associated with them as well. So the next one I'm going to cover is how can we build a more sustainable supply chain by identifying, collaborating with, and ensuring our suppliers and partners are aware of and share our commitment to sustainability. In this one, we actually, I'll talk about scope three emissions some later as well, because we see this as a challenge area for folks. We had multiple questions as it relates to supplier engagement as well as quantifying the impacts from suppliers. And in terms of, you know, building a more sustainable supply chain and collaborating with suppliers, um, one of the first things is if you as a business have developed your own environmental policy, and you're, company wide working towards certain goals. Part of ensuring your suppliers can help you meet those is communicating those goals and those policies out with your suppliers. So that can take a number of forms, whether it's via just calls or during the contracting process or putting out informative collateral. You could even do webinars with your suppliers, as well as if you're quantifying your impacts and disclosing those through sustainability reporting, ensuring that all of your suppliers have a copy of that report. In terms of, collaborating with them, if you're quantifying scope three emissions, which, are basically everything besides your direct emissions from energy consumption, as well as your like emissions from consuming electricity. So supply chain falls under scope three. If you're quantifying those emissions, you're likely relying on your suppliers for data. And some of those data points can come through, your accounting department and procurement, where you're looking at, well, how much of this thing are we purchasing from our suppliers? But your suppliers might be taking action or have done the math associated with their products or the things you're procuring already. So having that open dialogue with your suppliers can not just make them aware of what you're doing, but also allow you to be more aware of the efforts that they're taking, as well as to then explore any synergies or any overlap. Right, you might find that you have goals in common that you can work towards. I mean, we've even seen brands work with their suppliers to implement projects. So if you're working with a supplier that maybe has, is one of your heaviest emitting sources because you're using them as like a co-manufacturer, there might be opportunities where you could help them to implement projects or reduction strategies. And then the last thing I want to maybe call out here is that, you're quantifying the impacts of your suppliers if you're doing your scope 3 emissions, and if you're doing a robust sustainability report, you might also be talking about the stories and the trade-offs of why you chose certain suppliers. So if you're open to making your suppliers, identifying them publicly, which you might not be due to, the complexity of your supply chain or privacy concerns. But if you're open to those relationships being public, there might be opportunity to highlight some of the wins that you've had with your suppliers in your sustainability reporting, which can then motivate your other suppliers to do more and to do better. Right. So the next kind of bucket of questions that we got in are surrounding carbon accounting and reporting. Um, so the first one we're going to tackle is, our business is growing rapidly. How can we measure progress towards improving our impacts when our overall footprint is expanding as our business grows? So this is one that is always really interesting to me, right? People come to us, they do their we do their carbon accounting, and they have their footprint, but they're also scaling up operations, right? Maybe they are expanding their distribution footprint, or they are adding new suppliers, or they went from operating 5 days a week to 24/7 because growth has been super rapid, which is awesome, right? If you're building a business, that is your goal, to scale that business and to grow and generate more revenue. But sometimes in tandem with that comes an increased carbon footprint. All right, because as you add more suppliers, as you start operating 24/7, all of a sudden your emissions profile is actually going up because you're consuming more energy, or you're distributing globally versus when you started, you were only distributing in the United States. Um, and with that, sorry, I'm seeing a question come through in the chat. I got distracted. Apologies. So as your business scales, as your footprint scales, what can you do about it, right? You've set targets where you're supposed to be decreasing your emissions, and yet you're watching your emissions go up. And there's a really important concept that I want to touch on, and that's emissions intensity. So as you scale up, even with an increasing emissions footprint, it's really important to work towards decreasing your emissions intensity. So if you're manufacturing a product, that emissions intensity often looks like your emissions per unit of product, typically either in grams or kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent. So it's really important to know your overall, company-wide carbon footprint, but normalizing that carbon footprint into per product terms, or if you're maybe like an office only business, your emissions intensity might be normalized to terms of emissions per square foot, or emissions per full-time employee equivalent. But basically relating those emissions into a given unit allows you to track if you're becoming more operationally efficient and carbon efficient as you grow. So I have a case study here, which this is Beatbox Beverages. So as you see, they actually have zero scope one emissions, a really small scope two emissions footprint, and then the bulk of their emissions come from scope three because they use a co-packer to manufacture their product. Um, and as you can see, they consider a number of emission sources in their overall carbon footprint, which totaled out to 6,806 metric tons of carbon dioxide. They then were able to relate that back with a greenhouse gas intensity of 445 grams of carbon dioxide per carton of party punch. An additional reason to normalize your emissions into an emissions intensity value is it's obviously to be able to track progress and to really see if you're becoming more efficient, but it's also a really helpful metric for your end consumers or your end users or even your employees to be able to think about things in terms that make more sense, right? Like, I've been in this space for a long time, and a metric ton still sometimes feels like a nebulous unit of measure, right? It's a metric ton of carbon dioxide, which you can't see. But when you think about it in relation to this thing that you're able to hold in your hand, it makes it more tangible for your consumers. Um, so so it's important to consider your growth plans when you're setting your carbon or decarbonization goals, right? You've got to factor in the fact that you have this plan to grow, you have this plan to expand your operations. So how do you work decarbonization into that growth so that perhaps you're procuring more energy efficient equipment, or doing fuel switching, or implementing renewables projects. There's any number of ways to start working decarbonization into your growth plan, and you also might factor that into your carbon offsetting budget. But emissions intensity is a really important metric to be tracking, because even as your footprint grows, the goal should for sure be that your emissions intensity shrinks and your overall emissions per unit of product, or emissions per square foot, or whatever that normalizing factor is, that would decrease over time as you try to make progress to your goals. Um, the next one I have is, how can we report in a way that's transparent and positive while avoiding greenwashing? Our leadership team is worried about disclosing impacts. So this is something that's actually been a hot topic in our Slack channel lately, because obviously greenwashing is a term that's been around for a while, but there's some emerging buzzwords in the space, such as green hushing, where you're taking action but you're not talking about it because you want to avoid scrutiny. There's green rinsing. There's green lighting. There's a number of new greenwashing related buzzwords that people are also now worried about avoiding, and want to make sure they're not misstepping. And so, in terms of how to report in a way that's transparent, um, you know, I think something that's paramount is really telling people what you did and also how you did it, right? So we're seeing a lot of brands disclose their carbon footprint, and that is great, but there are a lot of ways to calculate a carbon footprint, and there's a lot of different boundaries you can set when carbon footprinting. So for example, if someone puts out a number that's, say, 1,000 metric tons carbon dioxide equivalent, is that's their carbon footprint. Is that their scope one carbon footprint? Is it scope one, two, and three emissions? What emission sources are represented in that? And then there's also the question of how did they get the number? So something that I'm really a firm believer in, and something that we do in our sustainability reporting efforts on behalf of clients, is we actually, you know, we disclose the assumptions that were made in the math. We disclose the methodology that was used. There's a whole lot of standards and protocols out there, and different emission factors and different ways to quantify emissions. Um, and with that, you know, there's a lot of right ways to do things. There's some wrong ways too, obviously, but it's really important to tell people what you did and how you did it. We're seeing there's data out there that many consumers don't trust brand sustainability claims, or don't feel they have enough information to verify those claims. So if you're gonna put data out there, do so, don't make vague claims. Like, there's a lot of buzzwords you can use that don't mean a whole lot. So if you're going to tell your story and tell your impacts, do so in a way that really is trustworthy and transparent, that highlights the what you did and the why you did it. And if you do so in that way, it makes it a lot easier for all of your stakeholders across the board, whether that's investors or employees or customers, to trust that data, because you're giving it to them. You're showing them how the sausage is made, and ultimately that really resonates with folks, and it lowers the risk of any accusation, because you're doing things in a way that shows people that, like, you stand by what you did, and you're willing to open the door into how you did it. And I just actually want to touch on this slide really quickly as well. So I mentioned there's a number of standards and protocols out there, and that can feel overwhelming in itself to navigate. So, there's the greenhouse gas protocol, which can guide you on how to quantify your carbon footprint. We're seeing more and more businesses submit reports through like frameworks and standards such as CDP, which was formerly the Carbon Disclosure Project. And it, following a protocol or a standard such as the, Sustainable Accounting Standards Boards or SASB, following these protocols or using them as guidance, it's another way, that can help, you know, give trust signals because you've shown your methodology, you've disclosed that you're reporting in accordance with a given standards. You might disclose actually to that body and then be compared to other companies um, in your same industry or across industries. So I do know that it can be scary to take that first step and make your impacts public, but it also, if you're in a space where few of your competitors are doing so, it creates the opportunity for you to be a front runner and be a leader in the space and actually drive change and motivate your competitors to do better as well. And then something that's also a consideration is your customers want to see your impacts, right? Like we're seeing a lot of data that you know customers even will choose what they buy based on the environmental impacts of a given product. So putting that out there can really be beneficial for your brand as well as have a return on investment. All right, the next one, which I kind of teed up earlier, is how do we account for scope 3 emissions in our carbon footprint calculations and what actions can we take to reduce them? So, scope 3 is going to look very different depending on the nature of your business. Say you're a consulting firm and you have, an office space, but you're not really procuring much, but maybe you do a lot of corporate travel. Those corporate travel emissions would fall under your scope 3. If you're in, say, like the food and beverage space and you're sourcing ingredients and or you're making a product and you're distributing that product, packaging falls under scope 3. Scope 3 is like this nebulous catch-all for a lot of people, and it can feel really overwhelming because you might feel like, "Oh, okay, well, I procure one bottle of this thing every year. Do I need to chase down those molecules of carbon dioxide equivalent?" And I think in terms of getting started with scope 3, it can be really important to just sit down and look at what are all the potential sources that would fall under scope 3. And then what are your resources? Like, are you doing this in-house? Are you using a third party? What are your relationships with your suppliers like? Have you done any supplier questionnaires where you already have some data and insight on a given supplier? But in the case of, getting started for scope 3, an important way to kind of help get started could be just to first look at what are the biggest sources of those emissions. Say you're making a product and one input makes up 90% of your procurement. Focusing on that thing first can be kind of the lowest hanging fruit of getting started. Um, the data gathering can be trickier for scope 3, right? Because you're not just relying on data that you already own yourself. You likely have to engage with your suppliers or start doing some research. If we're talking about like agricultural inputs, you might be looking for life cycle assessment factors for a given ingredient. So scope 3 can be intensive, and so it's one of those things like you kind of just have to get started and you have to do it. Well, I guess technically you don't have to. Let me backtrack you. There are some emerging regulations that might require you to do so. In the voluntary space, there's no technical like obligation, but at the same time, depending on your operations, scope 3 really could be the the biggest source of emissions in your overall carbon footprint. So I do feel it's really important for brands to step up and start calculating their scope 3 emissions. And it's something that you can build on over time. You don't have to go from 0 to 1,000 and catch every single source. But maybe the first pass you get as many as you can, and then you're like, okay, this one scope 3 emission source is really tricky, and I'm gonna have to like figure out the data for it or talk to this person, and maybe you know that one takes a little longer. I think in this race to get things done, you've still got to be pragmatic. And a lot of times, if you're a smaller business, sustainability might be a hat that you wear on top of your everyday role. And so it can, scope 3 can feel overwhelming, but at the same time, if you really take a step back and just break it down in terms of what are the sources, which sources are most most heavily like impactful to your business, and really start there and approach it pragmatically. I think it's very much it's manageable. In terms of actions to reduce them, this is another place where you might have influence, but you have less control. So you can look at, if maybe a supplier that has really high emissions, and that maybe you have to work with them because of Z reasons. Like, is there the opportunity to work in decarbonization goals to your contract, or work contractually obligate them to provide data? And again, that can take time to set up depending on your contracting cycle. So the strategy really does look different depending on the nature of your scope 3 emissions. But I think the fact that we're seeing these questions, people are interested in tackling it and rising to the challenge, which is encouraging to see. The last kind of bucket of questions that we got in advance of the session were around goal setting. And the first one is how do we set realistic and impactful sustainability goals for our organization? And with this one, I cannot, stress enough the importance of knowing where you're at before you set goals. Goal setting is super important to making progress and decarbonizing or reducing your water impacts or waste impacts. But um, we're seeing people race to set net zero targets or carbon reduction targets before they actually know what their carbon footprint is. And knowing where you're at today will help enable you to set goals that are achievable and things you can work for, as well as to start planning for how you're going to achieve them. So once you have a baseline, you can set goals and start measuring progress towards those goals. And it's important even in this space where we're seeing people set goals, for 2030 or 2040 and even beyond into 2050. Those targets are great, but what are those milestones you're working towards in between, right? Like if you're going to go from X carbon footprint today to net zero in 2040, what's your pathway to get there? Because ultimately, um, you know carbon credits are a tool and they're a really important lever for offsetting emissions, but direct decarbonization is important, and it takes time and money and planning. So if you've set a 2040 target, you can't wait till 2039 to start working towards that. So really it's about being pragmatic, knowing where you're at today, and then setting interim milestones that you can work towards, as well as continually tracking your progress and looking back at where are we at today in comparison to last year and 5 years 5 years ago. And also something to consider is that your goals may adjust, right? Technology is changing. So a technology might emerge to help you reach your goals that you hadn't even accounted for when you set those goals. So I will say that sustainability is a really agile space in that You do have to adapt and adjust, but you don't want to set goals and make them public and then backtrack on them. And I hate to call out Crocs because like I actually love their footwear and wear them pretty regularly, but they set a 2030 net zero target and then just recently pushed that back to 2040, once they realized, the work and what it would take. And good on them for owning it and putting it out there and like, stating it. But at the same time, like if you're going to go about this, do so pragmatically in a way that you can avoid that misstep, right? You want to deliver on your goals both for the planet as well as for your stakeholders. The next one is, our company has achieved carbon neutrality. What are the next steps to strive for? Like, for example, carbon negativity. So I think the first thing to consider is, what are you carbon neutral for? Are you carbon neutral for scope one, two, and three? Or are you just carbon neutral for scope one and two? And if it's the latter, I would encourage you to, first expand, going carbon neutral for scope three before considering going beyond beyond carbon neutral. The next thing to consider is how did you go about carbon neutrality? Were you able to directly decarbonize, or did you rely exclusively on carbon credits, or some combination? Um, and then, really look at, were they high quality carbon credits? Are there opportunities to do more direct decarbonization? And then once you've really optimized and like you're doing carbon neutral in the best way that you can, carbon negativity, or sometimes also referred to as climate positive, is absolutely a great goal. And basically, it means that you're offsetting emissions. You're offsetting beyond zero, right? So your offsets are greater than your emissions. And it's something, you by investing in carbon credits to offset your emissions, you're investing in decarbonization activities globally. So definitely a great goal to strive for. And then also, again, I'm gonna go back to something I talked about earlier, is not to look at carbon in a vacuum, right? Are there opportunities to set or work towards water goals and waste goals? There's a lot of ways you can positively impact the environment beyond reaching carbon neutral or even carbon negative. And then we've actually got one more bucket here. I apologize. I think I said the last one was the last one. So carbon credits. When choosing carbon credits to offset our emissions, how can we choose high quality carbon credits? So this is something that's it's really important to me, is that while a carbon credit represents 1 metric ton of dioxide equivalent, not all carbon credits are created equal. And if you're going to be using, carbon credits to offset your emissions, if you're using that lever as a tool to reach your goals, it's really important to invest in high quality carbon credits. Um, and that can look like a bunch of different things. There are some emerging, ratings bodies out there, and people, protocols around quality credits. But I'm going to really dig into the core ones that are, important to us. So, is the project additional? And that's something that means, like, would the project have happened otherwise in the absence of this carbon credit, or in business as usual? And if it would have happened business as usual, that project is not additional, and not something you should invest in. You also want projects that are real and credible and have been compared to a credible baseline. So, to ensure that that project is taking real action, you first have to look at what was the baseline state before implementing the project. And then you've also got to look at measurement and protocols. How was that carbon reduction or carbon sequestration measured? Was it done so accurately? And then something that is really paramount to me is, was it third party verified? Third party verification and credits from high quality registries or trustworthy registries that require third party verification is a really important consideration. That verification ensures that the math associated with issuing that credit was accurate, that boots on the ground, that project exists. And in the case of, say, like a reforestation project, those trees were planted in the ground and they are growing, they are sequestering that carbon. You also want to avoid double counting. So, in the case of reputable registries, when you retire a carbon credit, that credit is taken out of circulation. So that at that retirement point, you have officially offset your emissions with that credit, and that credit can no longer be applied to anyone else's emissions profile. It can no longer be used again. In a you don't want to buy a carbon credit that's double counting in emissions reductions or as part of multiple carbon credit programs. So it can feel really complex to navigate, but it's definitely, you want to ensure that with your budget that you're spending on carbon credits, you're investing in high quality projects. And then something that we also really like to look at are co-benefits of a carbon project. So um, obviously you want to ensure that there's accuracy and verification and confidence in that carbon credit representing 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide. But also, is that project doing anything else beneficial for the environment? Is it increasing or protecting biodiversity? Is there an aquifer restoration component? Has it created jobs or health benefits in the community in which it was implemented? Co-benefits can be, a great value add when you're, procuring carbon credits. And then the last one I think that we have before I go over to audience questions is we've done the math for our scope 1 and 2 carbon footprint, and we want to offset that to achieve carbon neutral. Where and how do we buy carbon offsets? And for anyone in the audience that has ever tried to procure carbon, whether for yourself as an individual or on behalf of your business, it can often feel harder to do than it seems like it should be, right? It's not like online shopping for shoes, where you have kind of limitless options. If you're looking to procure carbon credits, and say you have, a few hundred metric tons of carbon dioxide emissions that you're offsetting, which is a pretty low footprint, and something that you want to offset, but your options look a little different. So you might go online to marketplaces to procure that carbon, such as like the Gold Standard Registry, which is one of the more reputable registries out there. They have a marketplace where you can buy carbon credits directly from projects issued by the registry. There's also some marketplaces like Cool Effect, which have projects you can procure. Something you'll find though when you're buying carbon in this way, you're really limited in terms of the types of projects you can gain access to, as well as pricing can be a little higher on a per ton basis. Um, but say you're getting into that 5,000 to 10,000 metric tons of carbon dioxide. You may at that point go through brokers, or do an RFP and send it out to several different brokers or developers, and try to source carbon in that way. And you might find that that's still, you're still getting a limited variety of projects, perhaps, because to some parties in the space that might seem like still like a relatively small volume of carbon. So something that's really important is, if you're working to procure carbon, identifying your goals beyond offsetting the emissions. Are there specific geographies you're looking for where you want a project that's close to home, or you're looking for specific co-benefits, or maybe you're looking for nature-based solutions? So we really, like at CarbonBetter, we do bespoke carbon sourcing on behalf of our clients, where we really tailor our project offerings to what they're looking for. And then we also have a carbon credit portfolio that we can transact on regardless of your volume of carbon. So even if you only have 100 metric tons that you need to offset, we can do that in a way that gives you access to multiple projects. But it's one of those things, I think, working with a party that you trust to do due diligence and verify that projects are high quality, and then really considering the criteria that's most meaningful to you in sourcing carbon. But a lot of how you go about buying it or sourcing it depends on the volume of carbon that you're shopping for, as well as your budget, right? You might have, goals of like purchasing, carbon credits from a blue carbon project because you're really passionate about mangroves, but your budget might not indicate being able to completely offset all of your emissions with that, but you might be able to take a portfolio approach and blend some of those mangrove projects in. Let's see. And then one thing too that I just want to touch on, and I maybe should have done this at the beginning, but I've talked a lot about scope 3 emissions so far today, and we've also talked a good bit about offsets. But I just wanted to really kind of show the net zero equation here, or the carbon equation, where we've got our emissions of scope 1, which is our direct emissions from operations. Scope 2, which would be indirect emissions from purchased energy, such as electricity, and then scope 3, which is really all other emission sources from supply chain as well as corporate travel. And then there's multiple ways to reduce emissions. So we've touched on carbon credits a lot, which equal 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide reduced or sequestered. But I really can't stress enough the importance of direct reductions, through operational changes, taking direct action while also using carbon credits in tandem as a tool, is a really important part of having a holistic decarbonization strategy. And then something we didn't really touch on today, but I just did want to call out as another kind of you know tool, is renewable energy certificates, which are really a lever for your scope 2 emissions. All right, and so with that, I have seen some questions flow in, so I'm gonna jump over to those. Um, let's see. Sorry, give me a moment. Bear with me. Let's see. The first question I've got here is, for small and medium-sized businesses, what are the best reporting systems to get started with? And I'm going to take this answer a couple of different directions because I'm not 100% sure what was meant by reporting systems in this case. But I'm going to start with the quantification perspective first. So your carbon accounting or your environmental impacts accounting, and I think there's a lot of shiny softwares out there right now, marketing themselves as an easy button for quantifying your impacts. But in terms of quantifying your emissions footprint as you get started, there's a lot of data to gather. There's a lot of business processes you might have to implement. So starting with a spreadsheet can be a really low lift way to start, and quantify from there. And then in terms of actually disclosing your emissions, there's a lot of ways to go about it. And if you're looking to disclose them via one of the standards like CDP or SASB, you're probably going to want to first compare the protocols and methodologies and see, do they have, like, for example, the Sustainable Accounting Standards Board has industry specific methodologies. So if you're an industry covered by that, maybe that one stands out to you, or maybe a lot of your peers are reporting through GRI, and so you want to pursue that. But I think choosing to disclose to a given body, like, isn't essential, and you also really just have the option to make your reporting public on your website and put your impacts out there in that way. So there's a lot of systems out there, but I would say it can be overly complicated, and it shouldn't be a hindrance to getting started. So I think there's a lot of challenges with some of the different software tools in terms of traceability and transparency, right? If you're doing this math for the first time, you really want to document the process. You want to document your assumptions and how you did that math, and that's something you don't always get out of like a SaaS solution. So I hope that answered your systems question, but if you want to build on it, I'm happy to dig further on that. Um, so the next question is, I'm curious about bridging the gap between typical scope 1 and scope 2 carbon focus and corporate sustainability and the more holistic LCA scope 3 type thinking you're talking about here. And then part of the challenge I see is communicating and reasoning on more complex data. How do you compare, for example, emitted CO2 and consumed water and biodiversity impacts to make the best decisions? All right, a multi-parter, so I'll do my best. In terms of scope 1, 2, and 3, there's really like a life cycle focused approach to scope 3. Um, that doesn't necessarily refer to doing an overall like life cycle assessment, but it's more looking at individual ingredients and things like that, or individual inputs. And again, so much of the complexity of how you approach scope 3 is really going to lean on what type of industry you're in. The greenhouse gas protocol is a really valuable place to start in terms of digging into best practices for scope 3 emissions. So for example, in the case of you're making a product that has, sugar as an ingredient, and you're sourcing the sugar from, let's say you're sourcing the sugar from somewhere in Europe. Like, is there data out there that provides an emissions factor for the manufacturer of that sugar? And then you're also looking at the transport of that sugar. So you're not necessarily looking at the full end of life of that. You're really looking at your consumption of that input as well as your receipt of that input. But definitely I would say like the most robust kind of protocols out there around scope 3 emissions really fall under the greenhouse gas protocol. So if you haven't dug in there, highly encourage using that as a resource. And then reputability of emission factors is a really important consideration, right? For scope 1 and scope 2, a lot of those emission factors, are published by, even, like EPA. So the Environmental Protection Agency has published, a number of grid factors for use for electricity emissions. But there's less out there for some of those like niche emission sources. So when you're looking for emission factors, if you can find emission factors that have been, that are in literature and peer reviewed, those might be the best choice. But again, it really depends on the nature of what you're quantifying, as well as what guidance is most appropriate. And it can be tricky to navigate. And I would say like, having support resources, whether they're doing the calculations or even third party verifying if you're doing the math in house, can be helpful in validating that you're calculating emissions in terms of best practices. The next part of that question I believe was around communication. Um, and the reasoning on more complex data, and how do you compare carbon, water, and biodiversity impacts. And I think part of this actually traces back to materiality, right? Where everything in this space has trade-offs. So maybe you're sourcing an ingredient from as close as possible as you can, but you're in a really drought ridden region. Or maybe you've chosen a specific packaging because it's lightweight, so the carbon footprint is going to be less when you transport your product. but it's less recyclable. So you really have to look at which of the issues pose highest risk to you, which are things that are highest priority to you, right? And when you do a materiality assessment, you can even, you can make the results of that, like you can share with your stakeholders, whether it be in reporting or other channels, which topics are most important to you, what goals are most important to you, right? Like if biodiversity is a paramount focus to you, then maybe you're making trade-offs in favor of biodiversity. But like, unfortunately, we're not in a space yet where there's like a magic bullet solution that is the best thing for waste, carbon, and water. So everything typically has a trade-off, and talking about those trade-offs and like why you chose them and how that thing aligned with your goals, can be a really good way to engage people in how you're going about things, how you're approaching things, as well as driving change, right? Like if everyone in your industry is facing those same challenges, is there the opportunity to collaborate even though you're competition, to drive better solutions because you're all really facing that one trade-off that maybe you can solve together, or you can push for bigger brands to solve as well. So um that's kind of why I personally believe the importance in talking about trade-offs, because they're everywhere, unfortunately. And what's the best decision for your business in relation to your sustainability goals might not be the same decision that your competitor makes, like, and that's okay. But it's really important to kind of identify your why, and go from there. Okay, I think that covered all the questions. um I'll give another moment or so for more to flow in. But I really appreciate everyone taking the time today and working through these. And I also want to call your attention to the QR code here to subscribe to our Sustainable Progress newsletter, where you can stay tuned on upcoming webinars and events, as well as content that we put out. All right. Well, I hope everyone has a great rest of your day, and take care.